Today we are diving into part 2 of this mini-series where we are learning all about how to respond to our emotions. If you haven't yet watched last week's video, go ahead and click this link before you dive into this one. In this part of the mini-series, we're going to be talking about control strategies, ways that we respond to our emotions that maybe aren't super helpful, and we're going to be kind of exploring when they are helpful, when they aren't helpful, what they are. We're going to be talking about all of the things today. So let's get to it. So, control strategies are basically activities that we engage in to try and control, I'll put control in quotation marks, control how we feel. Typically they fall into two separate categories, and again, if you want to dive more into these concepts, definitely check out a book called The Happiness Trap. I really love how this book describes the different categories of control strategies because they remind us that our responses to our emotions are really coming from our nervous system threat response. The book labels these categories as fight strategies and flight strategies. And these labels symbolize our fight or flight response, which is our body's threat response to things that it thinks is dangerous. When we are experiencing an emotion that is unpleasant, maybe things like depression, anxiety, shame, grief. One thing that gets us stuck in our suffering while we experience these emotions is our body identifying, or I should say our brain identifying these emotions as threatening, as dangerous. So not only are we experiencing the discomfort from the emotion itself, but now we're also having a threat response. Our brain is signaling danger, danger, that we're experiencing something that is uncomfortable. So it kind of perpetuates our suffering in that way. So let's break that down just a little bit more. So there's a trigger. We have an emotional response to that trigger, and then we have a threat response or a judgment based on the emotion that we're experiencing. And then we categorize this emotion as bad or threatening, which tends to lead us to having more uncomfortable emotions like frustration, anger, or more anxiety. We also tend to feel this sense of urgency to try and eliminate this discomfort as quickly as possible. And that's where these control strategies come into play. So let's walk through them one by one so you have a good idea of what these control strategies are and if you might be engaging in some of these in your life. Flight strategies include things like escaping, distraction, zoning out. So when we are fleeing, think fleeing when we're talking about flight strategies, we're trying to kind of get away from the threat. And speaking of getting away from the threat, we can start with escaping. Escaping is when we are actually avoiding people, places, situations in general, maybe events that we maybe don't want to go to. We are avoiding these things so we don't have to feel the uncomfortable like anxiety or other emotions that we expect. So it's kind of a preemptive protective mechanism. Distraction is when we are trying to focus our attention on something else, something other than the uncomfortable thoughts or uncomfortable feelings that we might be experiencing. So this could look like watching TV for hours or constantly being on the phone or texting people, just really trying to take our attention away from what's going on internally and focus it on something else. Zoning out is another way to avoid our thoughts or emotions. Some ways of zoning out could include things like self-medication, drinking alcohol, using drugs, sleeping much more than the usual 8 to 9 hours, those types of things. And then we have our fight strategies, which include things like suppression, arguing, taking charge, and something I call our inner critic. Suppression is when we try to push our thoughts and emotions so far out of our mind that we never have to think about them. We're kind of packing them down into like this deep, dark cavity in our mind. Arguing is what I typically call our internal battle. Sometimes this can feel like we have different parts of ourselves and they're kind of just yelling back and forth at each other. Taking charge is when we're trying to internally change how we are thinking or how we are feeling. So this may look like a lot of self-talk, kind of like bullying self-talk, similar to an internal critic, but a little bit different. When we are taking charge, we're trying to force ourselves to change how we're feeling, how we're thinking. So we might tell ourselves, get over it, or stop thinking about this thing. We could also call this one toxic positivity. Basically, when we're talking about taking charge, it's like we're trying to force ourselves to be happy, to put on that happy face, even when we are so far from happy. Our inner critic can also come out super strong in these situations. It might start by bullying you, calling you names, or even trying to shame you. This could look like name calling, things like, gosh, you're so lame for feeling this way. Why are you responding in the way that you are? You shouldn't be responding in the way that you are. That makes you broken or a bad person, or all of the just mean things that we can say to ourselves. Okay, so now that we have a pretty good idea of what control strategies are, what they look like in your life, let's take a look now at how and why they can become unhelpful for us. When we use these types of strategies in moderation, when they aren't negatively impacting our life or making us do things that kind of go against our values, they are increasing our suffering, and when they're basically just not interrupting the life that we want to live, they're not necessarily problematic. However, if we're using these strategies all the time to the point where we're never really processing any of our emotions, this can lead to our emotions becoming stuck within our body. And when they get stuck, they get stuck. They show up in other ways. Sometimes that can look like chronic pain, or just being sick a lot of the time, or just a lot of different uncomfortable ways that emotions can show up. And it can seem really overwhelming to even let a little tiny bit of the emotions out, because it feels like too much to handle. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, well, then how the heck do I know if these are being harmful or helpful to me? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Becoming self-aware is half the battle, probably more than half the battle. As you go about your day, try to pay attention to how you're feeling, how you're responding to your emotions, and also if there are any downsides or any consequences to how you are responding to your emotions. Maybe you do this just throughout your day, kind of checking in intentionally or with a bit of mindfulness, checking in with yourself, how you're feeling, all the things. Or you can set aside some time at the end of your day to reflect and check in that way. See how you were feeling, maybe the majority of the day, how you were coping with it, how you were responding to it, and see if there were any consequences, just as in like a reflection kind of way. The authors of The Happiness Trap have actually created a bunch of free resources to assist us in going through this process. You can find these resources by heading to thehappinesstrap.com and then click free resources and then go into edition 1 resources. I'm going to leave a link down in the description just for your convenience. If this video has been helpful for you in any way, please do let me know by hitting that like button. Maybe drop me a note down in the comments, and I will see you next week for part 3 of this mini series where we will be actually looking at a healthier, more sustainable way of responding to our emotions. I'll see you then.